Richard Mason sat at his sleek glass desk, eyes fixed on the surveillance footage. "You stole from me." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. Margaret Evans, the elderly cleaning woman, stood before him, her weathered hands clasped tightly together. Her eyes, wide with disbelief, darted between Richard and the screen. "Mr. Mason, I would never." "Save it." Richard's voice cut through her stammering like a knife. He rose from his chair, towering over the diminutive woman. "The evidence is right there. My watch, worth more than you'd make in a decade, vanishing the moment you enter my office." Margaret's lips trembled, her face a canvas of shock and hurt. "Please, sir, there must be some mistake. I've worked here for years, And now you're fired." Richard's cold gaze swept over her, devoid of empathy. "Security will escort you out. Consider yourself lucky I'm not pressing charges." The door opened, and Samantha Davis, Richard's assistant, stepped in, her brow furrowed as she took in the scene. "Mr. Mason, is everything all right?" Richard barely spared her a glance. "Ms. Davis, ensure that Margaret Evans is removed from the premises immediately, and inform HR to blacklist her." Samantha's eyes widened. "Sir, are you sure? Margaret's been with us for—" Did I stutter? Richard's sharp tone brooked no argument. This company has no place for thieves, regardless of their tenure. Margaret's shoulders slumped, defeat etched in every line of her face. "I understand. I'll go." She turned, shuffling towards a door. As she passed Samantha, the assistant caught a whispered murmur. "I never wanted him to know." Samantha's brow furrowed, but before she could process the cryptic statement, Richard's voice rang out. "And let this be a lesson to everyone." He addressed the office beyond, where curious faces peered through the glass walls. "No one is above suspicion. No one is irreplaceable." The door closed behind Margaret, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Richard returned to his seat, straightening his already impeccable tie. "Ms. Davis, reschedule my 2 p.m. I need to speak with George about tightening security measures." Samantha hesitated. "Mr. Mason, if I may, are you certain about this? Margaret's always been loyal." Richard's laugh was devoid of humor. "That's what they all want you to think. Trust me, Ms. Davis. In this world, loyalty is just another commodity to be bought and sold." Samantha's lips thinned, but she nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll make the arrangements." As she turned to leave, Richard called out, "And Samantha, remember, in this company, we reward strength and punish weakness. It's how we've gotten to where we are." The door clicked shut, leaving Richard alone with his thoughts. He swiveled his chair, gazing out at the city skyline. His empire, built from nothing, stretched before him. Yet, as he watched Margaret's hunched form disappear into a taxi far below, an unfamiliar twinge of something flickered in his chest. He squashed it ruthlessly. Sentiment was for the weak, and Richard Mason was anything but weak. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Mason, Mr. Anderson is here to see you." "Send him in." George Anderson strode into the office, every inch the shark in a tailored suit. "Richard, my friend, I heard you had some excitement this morning." Richard's lips curled into a cold smile. "Nothing I couldn't handle. Just reminding everyone who's in charge." George clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. No room for dead weight in this company." "Precisely." Richard gestured to the chair across from him. "Now about that merger." As they delve into business, the incident with Margaret faded to the background. Yet, unbeknownst to Richard, the wheels of fate had already been set in motion. Across town, in a dingy apartment, Margaret Evans sat on the edge of her bed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Her gnarled fingers clutched a faded photograph, a young boy with Richard's eyes, smiling at the camera. "I'm so sorry, my boy," she whispered. "I only wanted to protect you." Meanwhile, in a nondescript office, Detective James Carter frowned at his computer screen. The background check on Margaret Evans had thrown up some intriguing anomalies. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he knew by heart. "Mr. Mason, this is Detective Carter. We need to talk. There's something you need to know about Margaret Evans." Back in his office, Richard's world was about to be turned upside down. The empire he built on cold, hard logic was about to face its greatest challenge, the unraveling of a long-buried truth. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across Richard's office, he sat alone, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. The watch he'd accused Margaret of stealing glinted on his wrist, a silent reminder of the price of his ruthlessness. Little did he know, the true cost was yet to be paid. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within Richard Mason's world. He arrived at the office earlier than usual, his mind still churning over Detective Carter's cryptic phone call. "Mr. Mason," Samantha greeted him, a stack of files in her arms. Detective Carter called again. "He insists on meeting with you as soon as possible." Richard's jaw clenched. "Fine. Set it up for this afternoon." As Samantha turned to leave, Richard called out, "And any word on Margaret Evans?" Samantha's eyebrows rose slightly. "No, sir. Not since yesterday." Richard nodded curtly, dismissing her. Alone in his office, he found his gaze drawn to the spot where Margaret had stood, pleading her innocence. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face. The intercom buzzed, jolting him from his reverie. "Mr. Mason, Detective Carter is here." Richard straightened his tie. "Send him in." Detective James Carter entered, his weathered face grave. "Mr. Mason, thank you for seeing me on such short notice." "What's this about, Detective?" Richard's tone was brusque. "Have you found evidence against Margaret Evans?" Carter's lips thinned. "Not exactly, sir. In fact, what I've uncovered, well, it's going to change everything." Richard leaned back, eyebrow arched. "I'm listening." "Mr. Mason, Margaret Evans didn't steal anything from you. In fact, she's been anonymously donating a portion of her salary to a children's charity in your name for years." Richard's brow furrowed. Why would she?" "Because, Mr. Mason," Carter interrupted, his voice soft but firm, "Margaret Evans is your biological mother." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Richard felt the room spin, his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. That's impossible," he stammered. "I grew up in foster care. I have no family." Carter pulled out a file, laying documents on the desk. "DNA tests, birth records, adoption papers. It's all here, Mr. Mason. Margaret Evans gave you up for adoption when you were an infant. She's been watching over you from afar ever since." Richard's hands shook as he rifled through the papers. His eyes, wide with disbelief, scanned birth certificates, faded photographs, and letters never sent. "Why?" The word escaped him, barely a whisper. "Why would she hide this? Why work as a cleaning woman in my company?" Carter's eyes softened. "From what I've gathered, she never wanted to disrupt your life. She was proud of what you'd accomplished, didn't want to complicate things." Richard's mind reeled, memories flooding back. Margaret's kind eyes, her quiet efficiency, the way she'd always seemed to anticipate his needs. "I fired her," he breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I accused her of theft and fired her." "Mr. Mason," Carter said gently, "there's more. The watch you accuse her of stealing, it was never missing. Someone planted that idea, manipulated the security footage." Richard's head snapped up. "Who?" "We're still investigating, but—" The door burst open, Samantha rushing in. "Mr. Mason, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this." She thrust a tablet into his hands. On the screen, a news article blared. "Mason Enterprises under investigation for embezzlement." Richard's blood ran cold. "What is this?" "It just broke," Samantha explained breathlessly. "They're saying millions have been siphoned off over years. The authorities are. Get George in here, now." Richard's voice was steel. As Samantha hurried out, Richard turned to Carter. Detective, I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger than a family reunion. Carter nodded grimly. I'll look into it, Mr. Mason. But first, what do you want to do about Margaret? Richard stared out the window, his reflection a stranger to him. In the space of an hour, everything he thought he knew had been upended. The mother he never knew, the betrayal he never saw coming, and a past he'd tried so hard to bury, all colliding in a perfect storm. Find her, he said finally, his voice hoarse. Bring her back. I need to make this right. As Carter left, Richard sank into his chair, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The empire he'd built, the cold, calculating persona he'd cultivated. It all seemed hollow now. In the quiet of his office, Richard Mason, the self-made millionaire, the ruthless businessman, allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in years: regret. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the drama unfolding in the glass tower above. But within those walls, a story of long-buried truths, unexpected connections, and the possibility of redemption was just beginning to unfold. Richard's world spun off its axis as Detective Carter's words echoed in his mind. Margaret Evans is your biological mother. The pristine office, once a symbol of his hard-earned success, now felt suffocating. Richard gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. This can't be right. His voice cracked, betraying the turmoil beneath his carefully constructed facade. Carter spread out a file on the desk. DNA tests, birth records, adoption papers. It's all here, Mr. Mason. Richard's eyes darted over the documents, each one a hammer blow to the foundations of his identity. His gaze lingered on a faded photograph, a young woman with Margaret's eyes, cradling a newborn. Why? The question escaped his lips, barely a whisper. Why would she hide this? Carter's expression softened. From what I've gathered, she never wanted to disrupt your life. She was proud of your accomplishments, didn't want to complicate things. A bitter laugh escaped Richard. Complicate things? She's been right under my nose for years, scrubbing floors while... His voice trailed off, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. The intercom buzzed, Samantha's voice cutting through the tension. Mr. Mason, George Anderson is here to see you. Richard's jaw clenched. Not now. Sir, he's insisting. It's about the embezzlement allegations. Richard's head snapped up. What embezzlement allegations? Carter frowned. Mr. Mason, I think we've stumbled onto something much bigger than a family reunion. Richard's mind raced. The missing watch, the doctored security footage, and now this. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Send George in, he barked into the intercom. George Anderson strode in, his usual swagger tinged with an undercurrent of tension. Richard, we need to talk. These ridiculous accusations. He stopped short, taking in Carter's presence and the scattered documents. What's going on here? Richard's eyes narrowed. Funny, I was about to ask you the same thing. George's gaze flicked between Richard and Carter. Whatever this is, it can wait. We've got bigger problems. The SEC is sniffing around, talking about irregularities in our financials. Irregularities? Richard's voice was dangerously low, like millions of dollars being siphoned off over years. George's face paled. Now, Richard, let's not jump to conclusions. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. Save it. Richard cut him off. I want a full audit, top to bottom. And George, if I find out you had anything to do with this. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but palpable. George's expression hardened. Careful, Richard. You're not the only one with secrets. As George stormed out, Richard turned to Carter. I need to know everything. About Margaret, about the company, all of it. Carter nodded grimly. I'll dig deeper. But Mr. Mason, what do you want to do about Margaret? Richard stared out the window, his reflection a stranger to him. Find her. Bring her back. I need to make this right. As Carter left, Samantha entered, her face etched with concern. Sir, are you all right? Richard's laugh was hollow. All right. Samantha, I just found out the woman I fired and humiliated yesterday is my mother. The company I built might be imploding, and the person I trusted most might be behind it all." Samantha's eyes widened. "Margaret is your—" "Oh, Richard." It was the first time she'd used his first name, the formality between them crumbling in the face of this revelation. "I need to see her locker," Richard said suddenly. "Whatever's left of her things." Moments later, they stood in the employee locker room, the stark fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows. Richard's hands trembled as he opened Margaret's locker. Inside, a lifetime of secrets unfolded. Faded photographs of a young Richard, newspaper clippings chronicling his rise to success, and a stack of unsent letters, each one beginning with "My dearest son." As Richard read through them, his carefully constructed walls began to crumble. Each letter was a window into Margaret's life, her struggles, her pride in his accomplishments, and her aching desire to reach out to him. "She's been watching over me all this time," Richard murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Samantha placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Richard, you need to find her. Make this right." Richard nodded, a newfound determination settling over him. "You're right. But first, I need to understand what's happening with the company. If George is behind this." "I'll start going through the financial records," Samantha offered. "There might be something we've missed." As they worked through the night, piecing together the puzzle of Margaret's life and the company's finances, a startling picture emerged. Margaret hadn't just been watching from afar. She'd been actively protecting Richard, using her position to gather information and quietly steer him away from potential pitfalls. "Look at this," Samantha exclaimed, pointing to a series of emails. Margaret warned IT about a potential security breach months ago. She saved the company millions. Richard's mind reeled. The woman he'd dismissed as just another disposable employee had been his guardian angel all along. As dawn broke, Richard made a decision. "I'm going to find her. Today." Samantha nodded. "What about George?" Richard's expression hardened. "Keep digging. If he's been embezzling, I want proof. And Samantha, watch your back. We don't know how deep this goes." Hours later, Richard stood outside a dilapidated apartment building, his heart pounding. He'd tracked Margaret here, to this rundown corner of the city so far removed from his world of gleaming skyscrapers and luxury penthouses. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Margaret's face, etched with surprise and a flicker of fear, greeted him. "Mr. Mason, what are you doing here?" Richard's carefully prepared speech evaporated. In its place, a lifetime of longing and regret bubbled to the surface. "Why didn't you tell me?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She stepped back, wordlessly inviting him in. The tiny apartment was a stark contrast to Richard's opulent office. Yet, amidst the worn furniture and faded wallpaper, there were touches of warmth, potted plants, handmade quilts, and on every available surface, photos of Richard through the years. "I wanted to," Margaret began, her voice trembling, "so many times. But I saw the man you'd become. So successful, so powerful. I didn't want to complicate your life." Richard's laugh was bitter. "Complicate? Margaret, you've been scrubbing floors in my company while I treated you like an employee." Margaret finished gently. "That's all I wanted to be, Richard. To be near you, to watch over you, without disrupting the life you'd built." As Margaret shared her story, the poverty that forced her to give him up, the years of struggle and sacrifice, the pride that kept her from reaching out, Richard felt his carefully constructed worldview crumbling. "All those years in foster care," he murmured. "I thought no one wanted me." Margaret's hand, weathered by years of hard work, covered his. "I always wanted you, my boy. I just wanted to give you your best chance." As the truth of her sacrifice washed over him, Richard felt something he hadn't in years. A crack in his armor, a flicker of the empathy he'd long suppressed. But before he could respond, the door burst open. George Anderson stormed in, his face a mask of fury. "I should have known you'd come running to Mommy," he sneered. "What's the matter, Richard?" Feeling sentimental. Richard stood, placing himself between George and Margaret. What are you doing here, George? George's laugh was cold. Cleaning up loose ends. Did you really think I'd let this little family reunion ruin everything we've built? As the tension in the room reached a breaking point, Richard realized the true cost of his ruthless pursuit of success. The mother he'd never known, the partner he'd trusted, and the man he'd become, all colliding in this moment of reckoning. The empire he'd built on cold logic and ruthless ambition now teetered on the edge of collapse. And as he stood there, caught between his past and his future, Richard Mason faced the most important decision of his life. The tension in Margaret's tiny apartment crackled like static electricity. Richard stood between his newly discovered mother and George Anderson, his mind reeling from the revelations of the past few days. George's sneer cut through the silence. How touching. The prodigal son returns to his long-lost mother. Tell me, Richard, did you get all weepy when you found out? Richard's fists clenched at his sides. What are you doing here, George? Cleaning up your mess as usual. George's eyes darted around the cramped space, taking in the faded photos and worn furniture. I always knew you were soft underneath all that bluster. But this is pathetic. Margaret stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. Mr. Anderson, I think you should leave. George's laugh was cold and brittle. Oh, what? You'll mob me to death. His gaze locked onto Richard. You have no idea what you're throwing away here, do you? Everything we've built, everything we've fought for, you're ready to chuck it all for some sentimental nonsense. Richard's voice was low, dangerous. You set her up. The missing watch, the security footage, it was all you. A flicker of surprise crossed George's face before his mask of contempt slipped back into place. Prove it. I don't need to prove it. Richard advanced on George, his eyes blazing. What I need is for you to get out. Now. George's hand disappeared into his jacket pocket. I was hoping it wouldn't come to this, but you leave me no choice. The glint of metal sent a jolt of adrenaline through Richard's system. Before he could react, Margaret was there, positioning herself between the two men. Stop this, both of you. Her voice, though trembling, carried an authority that froze them in place. Haven't there been enough lies? Enough pain? George's hand wavered, the gun half drawn. Richard's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. And Wipey, open up. The color drained from George's face. He looked wildly between Richard and the door, desperation etched in every line of his face. Richard seized the opportunity. In one fluid motion, he disarmed George, sending the gun skittering across the floor. The door burst open, revealing Detective Carter and a team of officers. George Anderson, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. As the officers cuffed a shell-shocked George, Carter turned to Richard and Margaret. Are you both all right? Richard nodded numbly, his world tilting on its axis once again. How did you know to come here? Carter's eyes flickered to Margaret. Let's just say we had a tip from someone who's been looking out for you for a long time. As George was led away, hurling threats and accusations, Richard turned to Margaret. The woman he dismissed as insignificant just days ago now stood before him, a pillar of quiet strength. You've been protecting me all along, haven't you? His voice cracked with emotion. Margaret's smile was tinged with sadness. It was the least I could do after giving me up. Richard finished softly. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I wanted to give you your best chance. I never dreamed you'd become this. She gestured vaguely at his expensive suit, a stark contrast to their surroundings. Richard looked around the tiny apartment, seeing it with new eyes. Every corner held evidence of Margaret's love, from the carefully tended plants to the meticulously organized piles of newspaper clippings chronicling his career. I've been such a fool, he murmured. Margaret's hand, weathered by years of hard work, found his. No, Richard, you've been hurt. We both have. As the reality of the situation sank in, Richard felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The anger and bitterness that had fueled him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by something unfamiliar. Hope. What happens now? He asked, suddenly feeling lost. Margaret squeezed his hand. Now we start over. If that's what you want. Richard nodded, words failing him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, to feel the full weight of his emotions. The next few days passed in a blur of legal meetings, press conferences, and long, cathartic conversations with Margaret. As the full extent of George's betrayal came to light, Richard found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about success and loyalty. Samantha proved invaluable during this time, her steady presence an anchor in the storm. She worked tirelessly to untangle the web of financial deceit George had woven, all while fielding a barrage of media inquiries. "The board is demanding answers," she informed Richard one evening, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. "They're talking about ousting you if we can't contain this scandal." Richard, who would have once raged at the mere suggestion, found himself strangely calm. "Let them try." Samantha's eyebrows shot up. "Richard, this is serious. Everything you've worked for is built on a lie," he finished, "or at least on a flawed foundation." He stood, moving to the window of his penthouse office. The city sprawled before him, a glittering testament to his ambition. "I've been thinking, Samantha, about what really matters." She joined him at the window, her reflection in the glass a mix of concern and curiosity. "And what have you decided?" Richard turned to her, a newfound determination in his eyes. "I'm going to make this right, all of it." The next morning, Richard called a press conference. As cameras flashed and reporters jostled for position, he took the podium, Margaret by his side. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming." His voice, once so assured in its arrogance, now carried a different kind of strength. "I stand before you today not as the CEO of Mason Enterprises, but as a man who has been given a second chance." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "For years, I built my empire on the belief that success was measured in dollars and cents. I was wrong." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "True success, true wealth, comes from the connections we make, the lives we touch." He gestured to Margaret. "This remarkable woman is my mother, a mother I never knew, who sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a better life. And how did I repay that sacrifice? By becoming the very thing she hoped I'd never be: cold, ruthless, alone." Gasps and whispers filled the air. Richard pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "Today, I'm announcing my resignation as CEO of Mason Enterprises. But more than that, I'm announcing a new direction for the company." He took a deep breath. "Effective immediately, the entirety of my personal fortune will be donated to the children's charity my mother has supported in secret for years." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameramen jostled for better angles. Through it all, Richard stood tall, Margaret's hand clasped firmly in his. As security ushered them off the stage, Samantha met them, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and admiration. "Richard, that was... Are you sure about this?" He nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "For the first time in my life, Samantha, I'm absolutely sure." Later that evening, as the media frenzy raged on outside, Richard sat with Margaret in her small apartment. The space that had once seemed cramped and shabby now felt like the most welcoming place in the world. "You didn't have to do all that," Margaret said softly, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Richard took her hand, marveling at the strength hidden in those weathered fingers. "Yes, I did. It's time I started building something that matters." As they sat together, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, Richard felt a peace he'd never known. The empire he'd built might be crumbling, but in its place, something far more precious was taking root. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with legal battles and public scrutiny. But for the first time in his life, Richard Mason wasn't facing it alone. He had found his true foundation, not in wealth or power, but in the unbreakable bond of family. As night fell over the city, Richard looked at his mother and smiled. The future, once so carefully planned and controlled, now stretched before them, full of unknown possibilities. And for once, He was ready to embrace the uncertainty, knowing that the greatest adventure of his life was just beginning. The morning of the charity gala dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the turmoil roiling inside Richard Mason. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. The face staring back at him was a stranger. Gone was the cold, calculating mask he'd worn for so long, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Richard, are you ready?" Margaret's voice, still tentative despite the progress they'd made, sent a pang through his chest. He opened the door, drinking in the sight of his mother dressed in a simple yet elegant gown. "You look beautiful, Mom." The words still felt foreign on his tongue, but the smile that lit up Margaret's face made it worth the discomfort. As they made their way to the waiting car, Richard's mind raced. In a few short hours, he would stand before the world and lay bare the truth of his past, his mistakes, and his hopes for the future. The weight of it all threatened to crush him. Samantha met them at the venue, her usual efficiency tinged with nervous energy. "Everything's set. The press is already gathering. Are you sure about this, Richard?" He nodded, his resolve strengthening. "It's time to set things right." The ballroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters jostled for position, cameras flashed, and the air thrummed with speculation. As Richard took the stage, Margaret by his side, a hush fell over the crowd. He cleared his throat, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. I stand before you today not as the CEO of Mason Enterprises, but as a man who has been given a second chance at life." Richard's gaze swept the room, taking in the sea of expectant faces. "For years, I built my empire on the belief that success was measured in dollars and cents. I was wrong. True wealth, true power, comes from the connections we make, the lives we touch." He gestured to Margaret, who stood tall despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "This remarkable woman is my mother, a mother I never knew, who sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a better life. And how did I repay that sacrifice? By becoming the very thing she hoped I'd never be: cold, ruthless, alone." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard pressed on, his voice gaining strength. "Today, I'm here to make amends, not just to my mother, but to all those I've wronged in my relentless pursuit of success. Effective immediately, I'm stepping down as CEO of Mason Enterprises. But more than that, I'm donating my entire personal fortune to the children's charity my mother has supported in secret for years." The room erupted in chaos. Reporters shouted questions, cameramen surged forward. Through it all, Richard stood firm, Margaret's hand clasped tightly in his. As security moved to clear the stage, a commotion at the back of the room drew everyone's attention. Detective James Carter pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim. "Mr. Mason, I have urgent news." Richard's heart raced as Carter approached the stage. "What now?" Carter's voice carried across the stunned audience. "We've uncovered evidence of massive embezzlement within Mason Enterprises. George Anderson has been siphoning funds for years." The room exploded in a frenzy of questions and exclamations. Richard felt the ground shift beneath his feet. How is this possible? Carter's next words hit like a thunderbolt. "We received an anonymous tip that led us to the evidence. Mr. Mason, it was your mother who alerted us to the discrepancies." Richard turned to Margaret, his eyes wide with disbelief. She met his gaze, her chin raised defiantly. "I couldn't let him destroy everything you'd built. Not after." The pieces fell into place with dizzying speed. Margaret's position as a cleaning woman, her access to offices after hours, her keen eye for detail. She'd been protecting him all along, even when he'd treated her with contempt. As the implications sank in, Richard felt a surge of emotions he couldn't begin to name. Pride, gratitude, and a deep, aching love for the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. In that moment, with cameras flashing and reporters clamoring for answers, Richard made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. He turned back to the microphone, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen, In light of these revelations, I'm rescinding my resignation. I will stay on as CEO of Mason Enterprises, but with a new mission. We will root out the corruption that has tainted our company and rebuild it as a force for good in this world." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders, replaced by a sense of purpose he'd never known before. As security ushered them off the stage, Samantha met them, her eyes shining with a mix of admiration and relief. "Richard, that was incredible. What's our next move?" He smiled, feeling truly alive for the first time in years. "We've got work to do, Samantha. A lot of work." In the weeks that followed, Richard threw himself into the task of rebuilding Mason Enterprises from the ground up. With Margaret by his side and Samantha's unwavering support, he navigated the storm of media scrutiny and legal battles. George Anderson was arrested, his web of deceit unraveling under the harsh light of investigation. As the full extent of his betrayal came to light, Richard found himself reevaluating every decision, every partnership that had led him to this point. One quiet evening, as Richard and Margaret shared a simple dinner in her small apartment, he finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? About who you were, about George, all of it." Margaret set down her fork, her eyes filled with a lifetime of regret and love. "I was afraid, Richard, afraid that knowing the truth would change you, would take away the drive that made you so successful. And later, I was ashamed of my poverty, of giving you up. I thought you hate me." Richard reached across the table, taking her weathered hand in his. "I could never hate you. I wish we hadn't lost so much time." Margaret squeezed his hand, her smile watery but warm. "We have now, don't we? That's what matters." As they sat together, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime of love and sacrifice, Richard felt a peace he'd never known. The empire he'd built was being reshaped, but in its place, something far more precious was taking root. Months passed, and the day of the reopening of the Mason Children's Center arrived. Richard stood at the podium, Margaret beside him, facing a crowd of eager faces, children whose lives would be changed by the opportunities this center would provide. "In a world where wealth often defines power," Richard began, his voice strong and clear, "I learned the hard way that real strength comes from sacrifice. I may have built an empire, but my mother, she built me." He turned to Margaret, tears glistening in both their eyes. "Mom, this is for you, for everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed. I hope I can make you proud." Margaret's smile was radiant as she cut the ribbon, officially opening the center. As cheers erupted and confetti rained down, Richard felt a sense of completion he'd never known before. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with the hard work of rebuilding trust and reshaping a company culture. But for the first time in his life, Richard Mason wasn't facing it alone. He had found his true foundation, not in wealth or power, but in the unbreakable bond of family and the strength that comes from choosing compassion over greed. As the sun set on that momentous day, Richard looked at his mother and smiled. The future, once so carefully planned and controlled, now stretched before them, full of unknown possibilities. And for once, he was ready to embrace the uncertainty, knowing that the greatest adventure of his life was just beginning. In that moment, surrounded by the joy of children whose lives he would help shape, Richard understood a truth that had eluded him for so long. True success isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives we touch and the legacy we leave behind. And thanks to the unwavering love of a mother he'd never known, he had been given the chance to build a legacy that would outlast any fortune.